Welcome to the Jubilee Road podcast with authors and bloggers Jamie Amarine of Sacred Ground, Sticky Floors, and Rebecca Huff of That Organic Mom. Each week you'll be inspired and encouraged by real talk, real issues, and the grace journey in real life. Grab a cup of coffee or sit as comfortably as you can in the carpool line and listen in for delightful conversation that'll make you think, sort through hopes and hurts, and most importantly, realize you're not alone on this wild, wild ride. Buckle up. Here are Jamie and Rebecca.
So today we are here with Heather Hansen, and Heather is the author of a book called The Elegant Warrior, How to Win Life's Trials Without Losing Yourself. And this is going to be the funnest interview ever. So Heather, tell us a little bit about yourself and where we can find more about you.
So I have been a trial lawyer for over 20 years and then wrote The Elegant Warrior to take the tools that I use in the courtroom to advocate for my clients and help readers advocate for themselves. I have a lot of those tools and tricks and tips on my website, which is heatherhansenpresents.com. You can see my blog there. I have a podcast called The Elegant Warrior. And then the book, The Elegant Warrior, How to Win Life's Trials Without Losing Yourself, is available. You can get it on my website or at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, all of the places where you buy books.
Cool. Okay. But anyways, I love the name of your book. I was like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to her. She's like my kindred spirit.
Yeah, the name of the book is really resonated with people, and it really resonated with me. I mean, I was out for a run when the name sort of came to me, and I was like, oh, that's it. That's absolutely it. So it makes me really happy when someone else likes it. I know that they're the person who's meant to read the book if they like the title.
Yes, it was just so perfect because she sent me, several other authors, and I was like, oh yes, this lady, I have to talk to her. So I love it. So you were just out running and this idea popped into your head.
Well, I had already written, I'd say 3/4 of the book, but the title, I had been going back and forth with the editor. And it's funny because my editor had initially, there's a trend right now for books that say like, kick ass or un-F yourself or F yourself or F everybody. And so she was sort of leaning in that direction. And that is so contrary to who I am that I think that in some ways the Elegant Warrior was sort of a pendulum swing to the other side. But I was really, I was raised not to speak that way, but I don't necessarily think that the difference there means whether or not you're elegant. I think that elegance, the thing about the word elegant that I love and that I talk about a lot on my podcast is the root of that word is to choose. It's the same root as the word elect. And so I believe that you choose your elegance. If you want to swear and cuss and that's the way that you express yourself, then you can still be elegant. That can still be your elegance. If you are wearing a t-shirt and workout pants, you can still be elegant. It's making a conscious choice as to who you want to be and then staying true to that person when things get rough. That's the theme of the book. That's the elegance and the warrior. And that really felt like the perfect fit for me for the content in the book.
That's so perfect. I love it. I mean, there's so many things about it. As I was reading through all of your information in your book, I was just like, oh my goodness, I love this. I love everything about it. And you had said something in there. I mean, we're just like jumping right in here. So I don't even know where the beginning of this podcast is going to be. But,
let's do it. It's more fun this way.
It's so fun because I don't know. I just immediately felt a kinship with you. But you had said like one of the very first things, I'm sorry, I don't know if you can see behind me, but there's a cat who wants
Oh my gosh, so sweet.
She's like, let me go out here. Okay, go out. They like to sit on the balcony and watch the birds and stuff. But one of the first things that caught my attention as I was reading the book was the very first thing was don't just complain, move. And you had a quote that I wrote down. Let's see. The only thing complaining does, this was at the beginning of the chapter, like an anonymous quote. The only thing complaining does is convince other people you aren't in control. And then you had, sometimes your perspective depends on where you are standing. Move and things can change, which I so loved because my therapist and I talk a lot about how the perception, your perception of choice makes all the difference in how you feel about a situation.
I love that as well. And it's a big part of what I work with people who come to my workshop. It's in my keynotes on, because there is, in any set of circumstances, in anything you're facing in life, there is a story, the story you're telling yourself. But if you sit down and really think about it, you can come up with other stories. You know, one of my favorite quotes that I often like to remember, and I'm probably going to screw it up, but the quote is, if you're having a bad day, try thinking of it as a comedy instead of a tragedy. So I mentioned to you that earlier today, I had a virus on my computer and now my Yeti mic isn't working. And I could easily tell myself the story that this day has gone to pot and everything's going wrong and my computer is going to be in big trouble and everything's going to blow up. Or I can turn that into a comedy and tell it as a story of a comedy or something in between. And there are so many shifts that you can make to see things differently, and all of a sudden everything changes. So I agree with you and your therapist, and absolutely that was sort of the point of that chapter.
Right. And it's funny because I don't think I've ever really considered myself a negative person, but my husband, on the other hand, is like a hyper optimistic person. And then we've been in marriage counseling, and we came to this point where he once said, I don't see the point in complaining, because that's just like taking all of my problems and dumping them on her. But he was so far to the other extreme of not complaining that he couldn't ever share anything with me. And so our therapist actually said, why don't you consider it sharing? So in some ways, well, how do you feel about that? Like in some ways,
I think that the difference between complaining and sharing is, when complaining is when you're talking about something that you have no control of and you're not willing to change or not trying to change. You know, I think that we should and can, a big part of relationships and a big part of getting better is sharing those things that bother us, sharing those things that challenge us, sharing those things that were difficult in a day. But I think the difference is, you know, if you say to your partner or your friend, if you can help me to process this, or help me to come to a solution, or help me to ask the right questions, or help me to object, all of those things, then I don't consider that complaining. I think that that's processing, it's strategizing, it's sharing. I think that when it's complaining, it's when that you just say, everything is terrible, period, without any room for making it better.
right. Well, she had likened it for him to whenever you taste something, you're really close to someone and you taste something that tastes bad and you're like, oh, this tastes awful. Taste it. Because she said, like, oh, that's sharing.
It's true. It's true.
Right.
And I do think, you know, when we share our challenges in life, we make them easier on each other, and we often can find different solutions. So that's imperative, but it doesn't have to be complaining. There's a difference. One of the big things I'm sort of obsessed with, Rebecca, too, is tone of voice. You know, if you say things in a certain tone, it comes off as a complaint. Whereas if you say the exact same thing in a different tone, it can become a springboard for solutions.
I totally agree with that. That's a very good point. I mean, and that brings into the whole texting thing where there is no tone.
Yeah.
So I think having a lot of conversations not via text is also.
I couldn't agree more. So I do a lot of work on depersonalization and how to sort of overcome that when you're dealing with, even right now, you and I are speaking to each other and we can see each other, but we're not in the same room. And because we're not in the same room, we actually, all of our senses aren't involved in this conversation. We're not feeling each other's movement in the air between us. And even that makes a difference. So every step that you get away from using a sense, you become more depersonalized. And that's something that we have to overcome, and also work hard to make more of our interactions as personal as possible.
Oh, couldn't agree more. And on that line, I had another question for you. I was reading, and this is kind of a little personal because I have a son who is just turned 22 and he's in college. He's getting his degree in computer technology, and he has Asperger's, and he is dealing with a teacher right now. And I know you talk a lot in your book about advocating for yourself. And then I love your acronyms, the one for younger kids, but I wanted to focus on the ones you had for college age kids. And it was DORM, right? DORM. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how?
Yeah, I'll have to pull it up to make sure I have it right. That's one that I have.
Discover, object, recognize tone and body language, and then move.
Yep, I have it right here.
So
Yeah.
he has a teacher that, and I'm just curious, like how you would talk to a boy, because he obviously doesn't want me to go advocate for him because he's a
No,
grown man.
right.
But how does one advocate for himself whenever his teacher, the person that he's supposed to be able to talk to, is belittling him?
Yeah, and it's a challenge when it's teachers. You know, the other you mentioned the other, and that's the four P's when your kids are a little bit younger. And in college, it gets difficult. You know, I always sort of make it the analogy between teachers and judges. You know, because in my cases, we have judges, not all of whom we get along with, not all of whom we agree with, not all of whom would we ever want to be in front of again. And yet they are the person who holds authority. They're the person who is in control of the courtroom. And so it's a difficult interaction to have. But I think the dorm stands for this. The number one thing is discover, because for your son or for anyone who's in that situation, you really need to know yourself and what it is you want and what it is that you're trying to establish. So it could be that, for example, there are some things that the teacher's doing that your son might not like, might not, but can deal with because he has to. You know,
Right.
everything's not going to be exactly as we want it to be. Like in the courtroom, there are certain things that some judges do that I will never like, but there's nothing I can do about it. So you have to really look inside and say, where am I going to set boundaries, and where can I let things go a little bit? And there is some need to let things go a little bit when you're dealing with someone like a judge or a teacher or a person in authority. So the first thing is to be really aware of where you want to set your boundaries. And then the second thing is object. And objecting is all about setting those boundaries. It's all about making it clear as to what is acceptable to you and what is not. And in the terms of doing that in the courtroom, one of the things I like to do is sort of draw circles within each other, right? So you've got yourself and your boundaries and what's most important to you. And then in the next circle, who's most impacted by you or the objection or the boundary that you're going to make? And it's probably the other students, right?
Right.
So by objecting, one great thing is to have your son talk to the teacher about why the teacher's concerned and how it affects the other students. Because sometimes you can bring the other students on as your advocates as well. So talk to the other students, ask questions of the other students, see if there's ways to find a resolution where everybody can win. I also think that sometimes with objections, especially when we're younger, we tend to get emotional when we object. And so that's where the R comes in. You know, be aware of, it says recognize tone and body language, but being aware of your tone and body language. You know, in the courtroom, the person who objects the loudest or the most angrily isn't the one who wins. It's the person who is most calm, collected, and has collected their evidence. I mean, for your son, one of the things that I would highly recommend is talking to the other students. You know, it's hard to talk in a vacuum because you don't know what the problem is, but
Right.
but compiling the evidence to support his position, so that he has documentation of, like, you know, you do this to other students, or there's other people that are also concerned about this, or, you know, you've done this way, you know, if there's some inconsistency in how the teacher treats people, documentation of the evidence and preparation for that, so that you don't get emotional, so that you do feel prepared, and so that you can then better control your tone of voice. Tone of voice has so much impact on the person listening, so that if you can really make sure that your tone of voice is calm, your body language is effective. One of the things about body language is the use of our hands, and the way that we use our hands to express ourselves can be threatening, but it can also be allow the other person to trust you more. And so to be aware of those aspects of how you're making your points and how you're arguing. And then, you know, the M in dorm is move. I mean, if things get bad enough, sometimes it's necessary to get a new teacher, go to a new class. But I really think that it doesn't have to get there if you handle the first steps well. And a big part of that, especially in college, is creating the evidence, the logic, the thought out steps that show the teacher that this isn't just a student who's like annoyed or being difficult. It's a student who really has discovered what it is important to him and has a valid argument to be made.
Wow, that's really good. And, you know, it's funny because in a way he actually moved through these steps almost naturally. But I think he had a little problem with the tone and body language one, which I think a lot of Asperger's kids would.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to me that you say that he went through them. One of the fascinating things about the work that I do around advocacy is how many times after I give a keynote or a workshop, people come up to me and say, you know, kids aren't taught to advocate in school unless they have a disability or something like that, because then they often are taught how to speak up for what they need, make their needs known, stand up for themselves. And it could be that your son has, either by osmosis or by training, and you may have also taught him how to do these things to make sure that he gets what he needs in order to get what he wants.
Yeah, I do think that that's a valid point. I mean, I think that maybe with the learning challenges, kids are equipped more, with the tools to, especially I feel like with Asperger's, that's something, we're constantly, okay, this is something that some people might think is odd, or this behavior might come across angry or whatever. So I think there's a lot of like pointing out these things. And so that's where that comes up. But since you mentioned the younger, students acronym, do you happen to have that? Would you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yes, so that's the 4 Ps, and I give that. And it's funny, we talk about younger students, older students. We all have the little child inside who doesn't like to feel bad, and one of the big things about bullying, which is really what we're talking about, whether it's a teacher who's maybe treating a child in a way, or a college student in a way that they feel bullied, or kids who feel bullied, the often unspoken victims of bullying are the parents of the kid who's being bullied, because it's a terrible thing to feel like you're sending your child to school where they're going to spend the day being miserable, and you don't know how to help them, and you don't know how to advocate for them, and you don't know how to teach them to advocate for themselves. So when we talk about these things, parents have to remember that they too are emotionally involved in the situation, and that they need to watch out for their own needs as well as their children's. So all of these things, the 4 Ps, for example, they apply as much to the parent as they do to the child. But
I agree.
Pause. Because, in the moment of bullying, or when your child comes home and tells you that they've been bullied, it's really easy to react, right? So whether that's to punch the other kid, or to pick up the phone and call the other parent and start screaming, or to call the school and start screaming. And pausing allows for a little bit of space to start to create the evidence and ask the questions and go through the discovery and do all of the things that make you a better advocate. So if you can, meditation helps with this. There's proof that shows that if you meditate or you practice some sort of mindfulness practice, it allows you to take some space between an event and your reaction to the event. So the first P is pause. Whether you're the parent or the child, if you can teach your child that they don't have to react to it right away, but maybe come home, talk to you, create some space around it, and then go into school the next day to deal with the problem, that's a really good thing to do. The second thing is plan or prepare, and that is to get your information together. A lot of that has to do with asking questions. Ask questions. If you're the parent, ask questions of the child. Well, how did the situation start? And how did you react to it? What did the other kids say? Because sometimes part of preparation, especially if you plan to take it up with the school, is to see if there's witnesses to the bullying, if there's other kids who are being bullied, if the bully perhaps is dealing with something at home that needs to be addressed. We know hurt people, and scared people are scary. And so sometimes asking questions and collecting evidence can also be a way to make sure that we're addressing the health of everybody involved.
True.
So the second P is plan or prepare. And the third P is practice. Rebecca, I would never step into the courtroom without having practiced my examination and practiced my opening and practiced my closing and being ready to say them. A lot of times when I'm speaking to women about advocating for themselves, and we talk about the Me Too movement, I encourage them to have a set practiced response to an inappropriate advance. Because in that moment, you're emotional and you're nervous and you're scared and you're upset. And so if you have a practice response that you can say, you don't have to think about it. And that's the same for children. If they can practice a little bit how to respond to a bully, whether that's to, say you're not being very nice, or I'm going to tell the teacher, or why are you treating me this way? I mean, there's a number of different ways to approach the bully depending on the situation, and talking that out with your parents and with your teacher. But then practicing that so that when you're in that moment, you're not all emotional, especially for a child who has fewer psychological reserves to fall back upon.
Right.
And then the final P is to hit play. It should almost be so prepared and so practiced that you don't have to think a lot about it in the moment. And you can go through these steps one by one over and over and over again.
Wow, that's really good. I love that practice. That had not occurred to me. We've had some bullying situations, but practicing your response, wow, how empowering is that to already know what you're gonna say, how you're gonna handle it.
Yeah, it's a huge way to, it's not even that you end up using those words, like, so for example, when I'm sure with you, when you give a keynote or you're talking to people, you practice so that when you get up there, you don't need to think. You can just, right. So it allows you the confidence to go into the situation, and chances are the child won't even use the words that you practiced, but he or she will have the confidence to go into the situation with a little bit less nervousness.
Right. And you mentioned the Me Too movement. And I know, and I don't want anyone to think that your book is just about parents, advocating for their kids or teaching your kids. This is about women and men and pretty much anyone who wants to know how to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, it's so funny. A lot of times at the beginning of my keynotes, I say, who in the room is an advocate? And people won't raise their hands. And the definition of an advocate is someone who speaks up for something or someone.
Right.
If you say you've really got to watch Game of Thrones, you're an advocate for Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
You got to check out this restaurant. You're an advocate for this restaurant.
Oh my, Heather, when you put it that way, I'm an advocate for so many things.
But then, Rebecca, here's my challenge to you. Are you advocating for yourself as strongly and as well as you are for Game of Thrones?
Oh boy, I tell you, I used to definitely not be a self-advocate, but the last probably 5, maybe 6 years, I've definitely learned to advocate for myself. And I tell you one thing that I think that you are doing that is part of the reason why your book resonated so strongly with me is that I think we both believe very strongly in mental health, and just promoting mental health awareness and teaching people that it's totally fine to see a mental health professional. I think, psychologists and psychiatrists have had a bad rap in the past. And I think that normalizing, seeking out a doctor for mental health, it's no different than seeking a doctor for physical health.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a psychology degree. I got that before law school. And I don't think that there's anything that has made me as good a lawyer as my psychology degree has.
I'm sure. Oh my, I'm so sure.
Absolutely. And I also, it's funny that you bring up the therapy thing, because I saw a joke on, I don't know if it was Facebook or Instagram, that really resonated with me. It said that it used to be that you would whisper like, oh, I went to therapy, like it was this big secret. And now especially the younger generation, they're like, oh, my therapist said this, or my therapist said that. And I think that the more that we destigmatize it, the better we're all going to be. These are tools that help you do better no matter what it is you want to do.
Right. That I think you have a good point that I think the new generation, like my kids, my older kids, definitely, when they have a problem, they're not the slightest bit bothered to seek mental help. I mean, they will go see, my one daughter is in the Air Force, and she will go see a therapist, provided by the military, or, my oldest daughter, she sees a therapist. She's been to marriage counseling before she got married. I mean, it's nothing. It's, to them, it is like going to the doctor, but I know other people that I've interviewed also who are my age have said the same thing. Like there was more of a stigma to it, but now it's not that big of a deal. People realize that, you know, and when we like to say, I don't see my psychologist because I'm crazy. I see her to keep me from being crazy.
Right. You know, I think it's such a wonderful way to work through some of it's part of the pausing and the planning and the practice. You know, you
Right.
do that with your therapist every day for everything that you deal with, so that when it comes time to advocate for yourself in the moment, you have sort of the space and the tools to do it.
Right. And I definitely think that is one of the tools in the toolbox of an elegant warrior. Definitely part of charm school. I definitely think it should be part of the art of womanhood. Not that, you know, I mean, our podcast tends to focus towards the female demographic, but, you know, I mean, everyone needs to learn to advocate for themselves, but
But women do need to do it more than men do. We just don't tend to. We tend to. I mean, there's all kinds of studies that show that we shy away from negotiation. We don't tend to know our worth. We don't tend to. You know, the biggest part of advocating in the courtroom and outside of the courtroom is asking questions. You know, whenever I tell people I'm a lawyer, a trial attorney, they say, "Oh, I should have been a trial attorney. I love to argue," and I always. And I'm always like, you know, I argue just a small fraction of a trial. In the opening, it's a statement. You're not supposed to be arguing. And then the closing is called an argument, and that's where you get to argue. But the rest of the case, all I do is ask questions. I ask questions to prove things. I ask questions to build credibility. I ask questions to show my client to be likable. I ask questions to challenge on cross-examination or to prove someone to be a liar. But women tend to even ask fewer questions than men do. So we definitely need to learn to advocate for ourselves more than most men. You know, everyone falls on a spectrum and not all men are really strong and assertive, but in general, we need to learn these skills even more than men do.
I think so. And I think negotiating is one of the things that is key in advocating for yourself, is learning the skills of negotiation.
Absolutely. It is something that women struggle with. And we also, for a number of reasons, I think we struggle with it because we think it's a male skill and we think that it involves male attributes like aggression and cunning and logic. And those are parts of negotiation, but the best negotiators are super intuitive and empathetic and gain perspective. And so women have the power to be phenomenal negotiators if they sort of shift their perspective, if they start asking more questions. And really, it's similar to what we were talking about with the 4 Ps. If they practice, you know,
Right.
practice what you're going to say, practice how you're going to respond if there's a counter in your negotiation for a raise. Prepare all of your evidence as to why you deserve what you're asking for, so that when you walk into that negotiation, you feel confident and ready.
I love the idea of practicing. I think that's my big takeaway from this interview. But before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you about this. I loved your story about Judge Maas, and I also love wearing black. But I love that story so much. I mean, it was sad what happened with her jewelry, but
So I'll tell the story for the readers for
okay.
the listeners in case they haven't read it yet. But Judge Maas has become a very good friend. But she is a very well-known judge in the Philadelphia area, and she was one of the first female judges in Philadelphia in a world of men. And as a first female judge, she felt it was important that she always wore black and that she always wore buttoned-up suits, and she didn't wear a lot of makeup, but she didn't wear her jewelry, and she wanted to fit in with the men. And she was doing a presentation with a group of judges in Atlantic City during the day. And then that evening there was going to be a cocktail hour. So she had gone to the day in her, you know, no makeup and no jewelry and her suit. And then she went up to her room because she wanted to change into her cocktail dress and jewelry, which she loved to wear, and put on her makeup, which she loved to wear. And when she got to her room, her jewelry had been stolen. And she took that as a sign that she should always be wearing the jewelry that she wants to wear. And now she wears multiple brooches at once and wears them. She's well known for like the lots of jewels and very always dressed to the nines. But she took it as a sign that she needed to own her elegance and to know what it was and to not be afraid to be who she was and to dress the part.
And then wasn't there something where she was at a panel or something? They asked, "Why are you here?"
Yeah, it was Walter Mondale who asked her, "Why are you running for judge?" Sort of like almost in a derogatory way, and she said, "Because I look fabulous in black."
I just love that. I actually laughed out loud when I read that.
You would love her. She's
Yeah.
she's an absolute phenom. You look at the women. This is another reason, Rebecca, that I feel so strongly about teaching women to advocate for themselves, because it's by looking at those examples that we are able to do it. And so the more I do it, the more my nieces will see that a woman can do it. And the more you do it, the more you have 6 children, both the boys and the girls. The boys will see this is how girls act. And the girls will see this is how girls act. And both of them will see women as advocates. So Judge Maas did that for me. I hope to do that for the next generation. And hopefully we'll continue to do that until it comes naturally for everybody.
Yes, I think that's definitely my goal with my daughters, is to, teach them that. But I loved what you had written. Elegance is personal. It's based on your goals and needs. I thought, oh, that's just so perfect.
Yeah, it really is a personal decision, and it's available to men as well as women. It really,
Right.
there's so many I have a podcast called The Elegant Warrior, and one of the questions I ask everyone at the end is, what is your definition of elegance? And every definition is different. For some, it's simplicity. I had a doctor on the other day, and he said that when they talk about elegance, they talk about like the perfect solution to a problem. So every definition gives me something that is enormously helpful to sort of expand my definition and make me see it differently. But it is very personal, and it's a choice. And it's a choice that you have to make consciously so you can be true to it.
Well, I thought it was great that you had written that, because we talked a lot about it in this season of Jubilee Road podcast, because when we announced that we were going to do an entire season on charm school, a lot of women were like, oh, so I have to walk around with a book on my head, or I have to learn how to put on makeup. And we were like, no. And so my co-host, Jamie, she is very Marilyn Monroe-ish. She has, the lipstick, and her hair is curled, and, she always looks really put together, and she loves jewelry and all of that stuff. And I'm more that organic mom. So I'm like wearing hemp or something, and I'm all natural. I don't color my hair, and I'm just kind of like the bare minimum lip gloss or whatever. And so when I'm sitting next to her, I had to come to terms with the fact that, okay, this is charm school. Look, she's so beautiful. And so a lot of the women were, concerned that charm school was all about the outward appearance. But to us, and we're trying to redefine charm school, it's all about what's inside.
Absolutely. And that's the same struggle that I think, one of the things my editor said is, well, what if there's some women who don't want to be elegant? And I think that once you're aware that your charm is completely inherent to you, it's who you are. So some people are charming because they're funny. Some people are charming because they're introverts. Some people are charming because they're smart. Some people are charming because they have a light in their eye. Like, your charm is an inherent part of who you are, just like your elegance is. And elegance can be hemp or Marilyn Monroe. And charm can be either one of those things as well. It's definitely personal, and it's a choice, and it changes. Both of those things change in time, and that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
I think the more that you can be aware of what it means to you, the better off you are.
Right. Oh, I totally agree. That sentence just summed up pretty much how we felt about the whole, art of womanhood and charm school. And I think The Elegant Warrior is just so perfect. It's absolutely perfect. Thank you so much for being on our podcast.
Oh my gosh, Rebecca, it is my pleasure. I love what you're doing. I love the way that you're approaching motherhood and sharing these stories and sharing what's hard and sharing what you're doing. And, because the only way that we get better is as a community and learning from each other.
I agree. Thank you so much for being here, Heather.
My pleasure.
Wow. Well, I just love your book, and I just think it's the most awesome thing ever. And I just thank you so much for being on here. It was amazing talking to you. I could talk to you for hours and ask you a million questions, but I know you have other things to do.
But I appreciate, I love your podcast. I love what you're doing, and I appreciate that you had me on. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I hope you have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining Jamie and Rebecca for this episode of Jubilee Road Podcast. If you loved this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it on iTunes so more women like you can find freedom in the grace journey. And join the girls here next week for another episode.